spring is here, the sun is shining, the birds are singing, so it must be time to get into some folk horror. Hello, if you're new here, I'm Sinead. This is my spooky corner of YouTube where I talk about spooky books, ghostly books, spooky films, spooky things in general, and then there is general shenanigans and lots of crack. Today I'm going to share with you some of my favourite books that fall into the folk horror genre, that wonderful section of horror literature that is all about nature and beauty and decay and corruption and paganism and probably some sacrifice. Folk horror is a genre that has been popular for years, but every now and then it gets a bit of a resurgence, and that certainly seems to be happening in the book industry right now. So there are a lot of great new books out there, but if you're brand new to the genre, I'm going to give you an overview of what it's all about, as well as some book recommendations. Because I'm talking about folk horror in spring, I'm now filming in broad daylight. The sun is moving rapidly as I film. If you see anything going across the screen, it's either, you can call it an orb, it's not just because it's dusty in here. Also, my cat is in here somewhere. He may jump onto the screen. I even put on my little kooky, folky cardigan to do this video. I'm really hot now. Oh, Jesus. There is so much to talk about when it comes to folk horror. It's one of my favourite genres, not only in books but also in film. I certainly can do a part 2 based on people's suggestions or any ones that I may have missed. I'll inevitably miss something brilliant in this video as I'm babbling on. And if people are interested, I'm happy to delve into folk horror films because, that's something I know. Now, what is folk horror? Little prop from my ritual days. What you may find if you are searching or researching folk horror for a definitive genre is most people refer to it in connection to films. Now, that's not to say that folk horror literature, art in any form didn't exist for many years beforehand. It absolutely did. But it really became very popular, and the term folk horror became very popular with the release of 3 really important films. You have Blood on Satan's Claw, you have The Witchfinder General, and the masterpiece that is The Wicker Man. You have M.R. James, Algernon Blackwood, and Shirley Jackson really championing elements of folk horror. If you're not sure if folk horror is for you, here's the things to remember. This type of horror is intrinsically linked to folklore. It's often to do with superstition, with belief, and nature itself. Folk horror books are frequently rural in their setting. There is a lot about nature, about the land, a lot of weather takes place in that, which sounds a bit strange. More often than not, it's set in the spring and the summer with the return to life and the blooming of everything around it, with a sense of darkness and decay underneath it. You will frequently have in folk horror books a fascination and reverence for the old ways. Really, that battle with the old ways versus the new is at the heart of a lot of folk horror. So that will often manifest as people observing old rituals, carrying out sacrifices, doing things that with a modern eye you would deem to be ridiculous and superstitious and not rooted in science or logic. You know, they might be referred to as pagans, they may believe in old gods, they may worship entities that are intrinsically linked to the land. The land is really important more often than not. You might have individuals wrestling with their own belief systems or entire communities observing them and being challenged, and the horror can come from a battle of wills or a battle of beliefs. It's not always supernatural, but creepy creatures often show up. Sometimes people are battling a big old worldy monster, and sometimes it's just the horrors of man at play. It also goes without saying that folk horror stories also have a lot of tropes from folklore, even from old fairy tales. There will be things and signs that you might recognize in folk horror stories as you're reading some of the books that hark back to old fairy tales or old tales that you've heard from the past. As ever, this is my quick definition. There are always exceptions to the rule, and there is always different nuance that you can find in different works. If you're interested in delving into the history of folk horror, I can recommend the Folk Horror Revival website. There's also a documentary, Woodland Days Dark and Bewitching, which is all about the history of folk horror. It's quite long, but they're quite good. Okay, history lesson over. Now let's get to the books. In terms of the classics of folk horror, you might want to get yourself some anthologies, and there are a couple I would recommend. One is Damnable Tales. This is a collection of folk horror stories with some of the masters in there. This is a great book to delve into the origins of the genre and actually see how it developed over the years. On the more modern side, folk horror short stories published by Flame Tree came out last year, and that's a collection of great folk horror stories by more modern writers and some really well-known ones. I have worked with Flame Tree in the past. They provided that copy for free. This isn't sponsored at all. I just think it's a really good collection. Another great anthology is Never Whistle Desolate Night, which looks at indigenous folk horror. So a great way of accessing folklore and folk tales with a horrific twist from different cultures over the ages. One of my favourite folk horror short stories of all time is The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. Now, this is a story that is much more about the horrors of man. It is not supernatural. It is outstanding. I don't want to give away the story of The Lottery. If you don't already know it, it is a very quick story that you should go and delve into. It is the story of a community, quite remote, quite rural, and every year they gather for the lottery. They gather for the lottery that is going to help them with the harvest. That is all I'm going to say. If you've read that story, this is the kind of territory you are getting into with folk horror. One of the most popular and most celebrated modern writers of folk horror is Andrew Michael Hurley, and I think his title of folk horror king, he's often called that these days, is well deserved. I absolutely love his books. He wrote The Loney, Devil's Day, Starvaker, and he also has his new book out, Barrowbeck. I love all of his books. The Loney may be my favourite, though Starvaker is the most famous, I think, of his folk horror books. Now, a film version of this has recently come out, and it is very good. It is very good. His stories generally involve a family unit, whether it is a large one or a small one, that has experienced trauma in the past. They are processing grief, destruction, whatever it is, and their stories are told against a backdrop of quite isolated, brutal landscape where people are working the land, people have a great reverence for nature and the simpler ways of life, and there's often something otherworldly at play in these settings. His stories aren't out and out ghost stories. You're always sort of wrestling with your head of really what is going on, what is happening, what are people manifesting from the world around them, what are the horrors that we hold inside of us and carry, what can our darkest feelings create. Starvaker, for example, is a story of a couple, a bereaved couple who are living in the north of England. The husband of the couple is working on the land. He is trying to examine the roots of an ancient old tree for his work, while his wife is trying to come to terms with the loss of their child. And she has developed an interest in spiritualism and a group of people who say they might be able to help her get past her grief by contacting the other side. It is a short but very dark book. The imagery all the way through it has a lot of folk horror tropes in it. So you have, this very sort of battered, brutal landscape that is affected by the weather. There is a hare in Starvaker, and hares are incredibly important in folklore and all stories of witchcraft. Not that this is necessarily giving you any hints about what happens. Just read the book. It is heavy and you won't forget it. Still have to read Barrowbeck. I have been saving it specifically for this spring because it is a collection of short stories by him, but they are all sort of tied together about one location in England, very much in the folk horror tradition. A book that I think is slept on too much, but it is an outstanding example of folk horror. It is the book Folk. And like Barrowbeck, this is a collection of short stories all set in the same place, dealing with different elements of folklore, of folk traditions that this location, this community enact. This is a collection of dark fairy tales, of morality tales, of belief, of superstition, of spirits, and of your own brutality. It is very beautifully written, and it does have a poetic quality to it. The language all the way through it, it really does read like an old fairy tale and almost like a sort of stream of poetic prose, but you do have great stories at heart. I urge people to go and look up Folk. One of the stupidest things I've ever done is give away this copy of this book. Someone lent me a book and I went, oh, read this. And I went, what have I done? Another author I'd recommend, if you want truly terrifying folk horror, is Adam Neville. I've said it before, I've said it again. Adam, why? Why must you haunt my dreams? Adam Neville is one of the great horror writers writing today, in my opinion. He does such detailed, brilliant, entertaining, and truly terrifying works. I have read several of his books, I've listened to some of them, there have been a few film adaptations as well. In the folk horror category, you have Cunning Folk, you have The Reddening, which still has imagery in it that haunts me today. I don't know what I was expecting from that book, but I was reading at arm length going, what the? And the absolutely brilliant The Ritual. The Ritual is a story of several male friends who go away on holiday. They've gone to an area in Scandinavia. They have to end up walking through a very dark forest that probably they shouldn't go into. It's never a good idea when you're hiking through a big dark forest and they start seeing symbols as they go through of strange creatures. Are they alone in the forest? Is this entity present? Or are there other people within the forest who are trying to send them signs or are trying to capture them? The Ritual was also adapted into a very good film, which I very much enjoyed. Adam Neville is a great folk horror writer. Be prepared, you will be scared. Just to say, if you're enjoying this video so far, please hit subscribe, save this video, like it, send it to people. To everyone who's subscribed so far and to whom I previously promised to send a crow, don't worry, the crows have been watching you while you sleep. Now, some of you may have been screaming from the start, folk horror, that sounds a lot like witchcraft. Really, you could do a whole subcategory of horror and folk horror just looking at books about witchcraft. But one that many people absolutely love, and I would recommend to others, is Slewfoot by Brom. Set in colonial New England, this is a story of a woman, Abatha, recently widowed, not particularly popular in the main community, and battling against the patriarchal society to keep hold of her land, to keep hold of her husband's fortune in the face of several figures who would like nothing more than to get her out of the way. And you know what's really good for doing that? Calling a woman a witch. But alongside Abatha's tale, you also have the story of the creatures, the beings, the entities who have lived in the surrounding countryside of this Puritan community for centuries. They are part of the land. They are angry that it has been taken over. And at the center, you have the figure Slewfoot, the devil, the demon, or father. The book covers Abatha's struggle against her oppressors, as well as the re-emergence of Slewfoot and his own battle with the spirits that surround him about what is right and what is wrong to do in terms of reclaiming the land. Now, I will admit, Slewfoot is about a 3.5 out of 5 star book for me. I just think elements of it weren't really particularly to my taste, but it does build to a fantastic climax. That saved the book, in my opinion, for me certainly. But it is an interesting story about folklore. It's very folk horror in its roots, and it's beloved by many, and a good story of bewitchery. So Slewfoot, definitely one to check out. It's also got incredible illustrations all the way through it. Fishboy I had a problem with. The books that I've mentioned so far all have supernatural elements to it, but now I have 2 books that I'd like to recommend that are not supernatural at all, but are still horrifying, have a sense of dread all the way through them, and are great folk horror tales. The first is Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss. When I did my folk horror videos on TikTok, so many people recommended go and get Ghost Wall. I did, I read it, everyone was right. This book is outstanding. Ghost Wall is told from the perspective of a young girl whose father and mother helped to do Iron Age reenactments in England to help archaeology students who are studying anthropology, archaeology, history, that they can see what it was really like for people living in the Iron Age. This young girl is having to work with her father and mother, her father who is a horrible man who is obsessed with the old ways. The story takes place over one reenactment where we see the young girl's fascination with the students, the carefree, young, happy students who are coming along and wanting to live their life and have such freedom ahead of them, and the absolute oppression she suffers at the hand of her father, who is completely obsessed with the Iron Age sensibilities, Iron Age society, the way that people conformed back then that he thinks is the right way. And we see him becoming increasingly unhinged to prove that the old ways were the better, and how he starts to influence others. The book takes place during the heatwave of the 1970s, so you have this quite luscious landscape, but really oppressive, overbearing heat, with this miserable sort of existence of people having to live like Iron Age settlers, and the really underlying dread and tension of what the father is going to do, the things that women are expected to put up with, to conform with. It is such a powerful short book. It is disturbing, but definitely a giant in the folk horror genre. In a similar vein to Ghost Wall is Water Shall Refuse Them. I read this book a few years ago because it was marketed as a slice of folk horror, and this also takes place in the 1970s in a searing hot summer. It's a story, again, of a teenage girl who herself is a little bit of an unreliable narrator, and the teenage girl has been privately practicing folklorish rituals, often involving death and a degree of pain and suffering, in order to maintain control in her life. I remember finishing this book and feeling it wasn't perfect, but the vibe and the atmosphere all the way through it was so strong. Again, the oppressive heat of the summer, but also this sense of dread, of foreboding, as this girl continues to try and maintain control over her life, but also her growing anger and her quite disturbing practices building against the backdrop of family troubles, of various incidents that are happening around the town. It really was unsettling, as all good folk horror should be. A book that more people need to be talking about all the time, in my opinion, because it is great folk horror, it is a great twist on the genre, and it is such a good story. It is Wylding Hall by Elizabeth Hand. This is Daisy Jones and the Six with ghosts. This is about an English folk rock band in the 70s trying to write their new album. It is all told through interviews and transcripts of the different band members, recounting some of the difficulties they've had in the interrelationships in the band, in their past, but also what happened when they went to Wylding Hall and one of them disappeared without a trace. It is such a good story. The setting is perfect. It melds gothic with folk horror because you have this old house, this old mansion where they're trying to record and write their album. This is a folk rock band. They're really interested in old folklore, in the old ways, and the land around them and the property is imbued with something supernatural. There is so much going on. I so enjoyed it. I don't know why people don't talk about it more. I should shout out to two books that I have not read yet, but people mention them all the time in the folk horror sphere. One is Harvest Home. Harvest Home, I know it is one of the folk horror books. I have not read it yet, and I know people keep coming at me saying to do it, but it is apparently such a good book, and people mention it all the time, and that it frightened them, that it thrilled them, that they really enjoyed it. Have you read it? Would you recommend that I dive into it at this time of year, or wait until harvest time? This author is fantastic, but I just haven't read this book yet. It's The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. I have started listening to it. I need to carry on. Stephen Graham Jones, just one of the most incredible horror writers, has a way of just absolutely terrifying you with great literary horror as well. One that people mention as great indigenous folk horror. It will be read, it must be read. Really, if you haven't read any Stephen Graham Jones, please delve into him as soon as you can. I'm also hoping to put out a deep dive into a pretty new folk horror book that is doing the rounds that people seem to love. I have thoughts on it. It's The Lamb, a folk horror tale of cannibalism. Watch out for that one. There is my introduction to folk horror. Of course, I have a list sitting in front of me of more books that I could be talking about. So if people are interested, please let me know if you'd like a part 2 and your suggestions of great folk horror books that I should include, that I should be reading, that I may have forgotten. Equally, if you'd like me to shout about folk horror films, I can happily do that. That will be a fun afternoon. Share your folk horror stories, or maybe even your favorite folklore tales. And would you like a reading of any of the short stories? I'm happy to do that. As ever, if you like my content, please subscribe to my channel, save and share this video, send it to people who need to be terrified about the things growing in their garden. Stay spooky, bye-bye.